Lady Aurelia Thorne decided, with the quiet finality of a closing book, that this would be her last ball. The decision brought no dramatic flair, no sudden urge to flee into the night. It settled upon her like a fine layer of dust, the inevitable coating on a life left too long on the shelf. At 27, she was a relic. In a room shimmering with the dewy youth of debutantes, she felt ancient, a fossil from a forgotten season. Her dress, a pale grey silk, had been her best 3 years prior. Now it seemed to whisper of genteel poverty, of making do. It was the colour of resignation. Her mother, Lady Danbury, fluttered nervously at her side, her fan beating against the thick, cloying air like the wings of a trapped bird. Every so often, her mother's gaze would land on Aurelia, and a familiar shadow of disappointment would cross her features before being hastily rearranged into a smile that did not reach her eyes. Aurelia had ceased to feel the sting of it years ago. It was simply a fact of her existence, like the sun rising or the bills arriving with daunting regularity. Since her father's death, their world had shrunk. The grand house was sold, the staff dismissed, and they now resided in a narrow townhouse that always smelled faintly of damp and boiled cabbage. Aurelia's only value lay in her potential to marry, a potential that had withered on the vine. She watched the dancers swirl under the chandeliers, a kaleidoscope of jewel-toned satin and beaming smiles. The music of the orchestra felt distant, a sound from another world she could observe, but never enter. Her fingers tightened on the delicate stem of her untouched champagne flute. It was a prop, a reason to be standing where she was, anchored to the edge of the room. "Look at her," a voice hissed from behind a nearby potted palm. Aurelia did not need to turn to know it was Lady Beatrice Finch, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her venom. Still haunting ballrooms like a forlorn ghost, you would think she would have the decency to retire to the country. "They say the Duke of Alastair is looking for a wife," another voice, belonging to one of Beatrice's vapid companions, supplied. "Perhaps she thinks she has a chance." A cruel laugh, like the crack of breaking ice, followed. "That old spinster. The Duke needs a broodmare with a fortune, not a dusty librarian. He would never look twice at someone so utterly plain." The words should have hurt. A younger Aurelia would have felt the heat of shame creep up her neck. But tonight, they were merely an echo of her own internal monologue, a confirmation of what she already knew. She was invisible, unworthy, a ghost at the feast. With a quiet murmur to her mother about needing some air, she slipped away. She did not go to the crowded terrace, but sought a familiar refuge, the host's library. The door creaked open to a sanctuary of silence, filled with the comforting scent of leather and old paper. Here she could breathe. Here the judgment of the ton could not reach her. She ran a finger along the spines of the books, her touch lingering on the gold-leaf titles. They were friends who asked for nothing but her attention, offering entire worlds in return. She felt a kinship with them, these silent storytellers waiting patiently to be chosen. A sudden chill swept through the room, raising the fine hairs on her arms. The air itself seemed to shift, growing heavy with a new presence. The door, which she had left slightly ajar, swung fully open. Framed in the doorway stood the Duke of Alastair. He was not a handsome man in the conventional sense. His features were too severe, his jaw too sharp, his eyes a shade of grey so dark they were almost black. But he commanded space in a way that defied simple aesthetics. Power radiated from him, a silent, unyielding force that made the very air crackle. The low hum of the party outside seemed to fade into nothingness, silenced by his arrival. His gaze swept the room, dismissive of the leather-bound treasures, and landed on her. For a long, unnerving moment, he simply stared. Aurelia's heart, so placid moments before, began a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She felt pinned by his scrutiny, like a butterfly under glass. She had seen him from afar, of course. Everyone had. The formidable, untouchable Duke, a man who moved through society like a wolf among sheep. He took a step into the room, then another. The silence stretched, thin and taut. She expected him to demand what she was doing there, to dismiss her with a cold word. It was his reputation, after all. He was known for his ruthless efficiency and his utter lack of patience for social niceties. He stopped a few feet from her. His expression was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic indifference. But his eyes, she noted with the detached observation of a scholar, held a strange intensity. It was not desire, and it was not kindness. It was something else entirely. It was focus. "Lady Aurelia Thorne," he said. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of any warmth. It was not a question. She inclined her head, her throat suddenly dry. "Your Grace." She waited for the dismissal, the curt nod that would send her scuttling back to the ballroom. Instead, he uttered the 5 words that fractured her reality. "You will marry me." The statement fell into the silent room like a stone into a frozen pond, the impact vast and shocking. Aurelia's mind went utterly blank. She could only stare at him, convinced she had misheard, that this was some bizarre, cruel jest. The whispers she had overheard moments ago echoed in her thoughts. A dusty librarian, utterly plain. I beg your pardon?" she managed, her voice a thread of sound. "It was not a request," he clarified, his tone unchanged. "It was a statement of fact. I have decided. You will be my wife." Her shock began to curdle into a bewildered sort of anger. Who was this man to command her life as if she were a piece on a chessboard? But then, the cold, hard reality of her situation rushed back in. Her mother's desperate face, the mounting bills, the bleak, empty future as a poor relation. This man, this cold, impossible Duke, was offering her an escape. A gilded cage, perhaps, but an escape nonetheless. He was watching her, his head tilted slightly, as if analyzing her reaction. There was still no emotion on his face, only that unnerving, concentrated focus. Aurelia drew a breath, the scent of old paper and his clean, sharp scent of sandalwood filling her lungs. Her life was already a prison of sorts. What difference would it make if the walls were marble instead of peeling plaster? "Yes, Your Grace," she heard herself say, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "I will." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his features. It was not surprise, but perhaps satisfaction. The look of a man whose complex calculations had just proven correct. He gave a single, sharp nod. "It is settled, then. I will speak to your mother." And with that, he turned and was gone, leaving Aurelia alone in the silent library. Her world irrevocably, terrifyingly altered. Her hand came up to her throat, her fingers trembling. The ghost at the feast had just been offered a crown. She could not fathom why. The days that followed were a blur of surreal formality. The Duke of Alistair made his intentions known to her mother, who promptly burst into tears of incredulous joy. The engagement was announced in the papers the next morning, sending shockwaves through the ton. Aurelia Thorne, the forgotten spinster, was to be a duchess. The whispers followed her everywhere, a cloud of confused, envious malice. The Duke called on her at their modest townhouse, his gleaming black carriage a stark, imposing presence on their quiet street. Their conversations were stilted, awkward affairs conducted in their best parlour, which suddenly seemed small and shabby in his presence. He was impeccably polite, his manners flawless. He spoke of settlements, of the running of his various estates, of the duties she would be expected to perform as his duchess. He spoke of it all as if he were outlining a business merger. There was no warmth, no affection, no hint of the man beneath the title. Aurelia listened, answered his questions precisely, and tried to peer behind the granite facade he presented to the world. She felt like an archaeologist studying a magnificent but impenetrable ruin. She would search his dark eyes for a clue, a hint of the motive that drove his bizarre, impulsive proposal, but found nothing. He was a locked room, and she had not yet found the key. He treated her with a detached courtesy that was more unnerving than outright coldness. He was a stranger to whom she was now legally and socially bound. A stranger who held the entirety of her future in his large, capable hands. One afternoon, he sat across from her, a ledger spread on the small table between them. He was explaining the vast, complex network of his household finances. The Duchess has traditionally overseen the domestic accounts, as well as the charitable endowments, he explained, his voice a dry monotone. My mother was fluent in French and Italian, which was useful for correspondence with our suppliers on the continent. He paused, his gaze lifting from the page to meet hers. There was a clinical coldness in his eyes that made her breath catch. You understand, of course, that you are not what society would deem a worthy choice for this title. You lack the connections, the fortune, the typical accomplishments. You must learn to overcome that perception with diligence and unimpeachable conduct. The words were not delivered with malice. They were stated as a simple, indisputable fact, which somehow made them cut deeper. It was the same cold assessment she had heard from Lady Beatrice, now delivered by her own future husband. The old feeling of worthlessness washed over her, familiar and suffocating. She was a business arrangement, a component that was, on paper, deficient. For a moment, she was the same cowed, invisible woman from the ball, ready to shrink into herself and accept the judgment. But then, something shifted. It was the memory of his proposal, the sheer audacity of it. He had chosen her, for whatever inscrutable reason. He had sought her out. And if he had chosen her, he did not get to define her as lacking. A spark of defiance, long dormant, ignited within her. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin to meet his cool, appraising stare. I may lack a fortune, Your Grace, she said, her voice quiet but clear, echoing in the small room. But I am hardly unworthy. She leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped on the table. I speak 6 languages. I can manage your household accounts in 3 of them. I can conduct your continental correspondence in French, Italian, and German. I can read the original Greek texts your grandfather collected for your library, and I can catalogue the Scandinavian poetry your father acquired. Can the other ladies, the ones society deems so worthy, say the same? Silence. The Duke of Alistair was, for the first time since she had met him, visibly stunned. His mask of cool indifference shattered, replaced by an expression of pure, unguarded astonishment. He stared at her, as if he had never truly seen her before. The air thickened, charged with a new and unfamiliar energy. He did not speak for a long time. The ticking of the mantel clock seemed unnaturally loud. He simply watched her, his dark eyes searching her face. The coldness in them was gone, replaced by a dawning, intense curiosity. It was the first crack in the armor, the first glimpse of the man behind the wall of ducal duty. Finally, he inclined his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "No, Lady Aurelia," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "They cannot." A strange and powerful shift occurred in that small, shabby parlor. Aurelia felt as if she had reclaimed a piece of herself she had long thought lost. She was not just a spinster, a burden, a plain face in the crowd. She was a scholar. She was intelligent. And she had, with a few quiet words, silenced the most powerful man in the room. The following day, a footman from the Duke's household delivered a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple twine. Aurelia's mother assumed it was jewelry, a prerequisite for a ducal fiancé. Her hands trembled with excitement as she urged Aurelia to open it. But inside, there were no velvet boxes. There were books. 4 of them. One was a rare, leather-bound volume of Italian poetry, the ink still dark and crisp on the vellum. Another was a slim collection of Old Norse sagas. The third was a Greek grammar, its pages filled with elegant, complex script. The last was a first edition of Dante's Inferno, a book she had once mentioned in passing she had only ever read in translation. There was no note. There was no need for one. Aurelia ran her hand over the supple leather, her heart performing a slow, heavy turn in her chest. This was not a generic gift. This was not a duty fulfilled. This was a message. I heard you. I see you. It was the most personal, most thoughtful gift she had ever received. It was a sign that the man she was to marry was not a cold automaton, but someone who listened, someone who observed. Her fear of him began to slowly, cautiously, transmute into a deep, consuming curiosity. Who was Alistair, the man, when he was not playing the part of the Duke? Their next public appearance together was at a garden party hosted by the Countess of Ellsworth. As they stepped from their carriage, a hush fell over the assembled guests. Every eye was on them, on the formidable Duke and his shocking, mousy fiancée. Aurelia felt the familiar urge to shrink, to become invisible. But the weight of the Duke's hand on the small of her back was a steady, grounding presence. He guided her through the sea of curious faces, his expression as impassive as ever. But Aurelia noticed the small things. The way his fingers tightened ever so slightly when someone stared too long. The way he positioned himself as a subtle shield between her and the most overt gossips. They were taking tea on the lawn when Lady Beatrice sashayed towards them, her smile a slash of predatory red. "Your Grace," she purred, ignoring Aurelia completely. "And Lady Aurelia, how quaint you look." Her eyes swept over Aurelia's simple muslin daydress with open contempt. Aurelia stiffened, preparing for the inevitable sting of the insult. "We were all just saying," Beatrice continued, her voice carrying to the surrounding tables, "how remarkable it is that a clever little spinster could manage to trap the most eligible man in England. One must admire the sheer audacity of the scheme." The air grew thick with unspoken glee. This was the drama the ton craved, the public humiliation of an upstart. Aurelia's teacup rattled in its saucer, her knuckles white. She opened her mouth to offer a dignified, if weak, defense. But before she could utter a sound, the Duke spoke. His voice was not loud. It was quiet, almost conversational, yet it cut through the chatter like a shard of glass. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his gaze as cold and sharp as a winter frost. I find my fiancé's intellect a far greater asset than a sharp tongue and an empty mind. He paused, letting the words land with devastating precision. I suggest you cultivate the former. Beatrice's face went from smug to slack-jawed. A wave of scarlet washed up her neck, a stark contrast to her pale gown. A few people nearby gasped. Others suddenly found their teacups intensely fascinating. Utterly routed, Beatrice could only stammer a garbled noise before turning on her heel and fleeing. Aurelia stared at her future husband. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a scene. He had simply, and with brutal efficiency, defended her. He had protected her. The cold, unreadable Duke had unsheathed his claws on her behalf. A warm, unfamiliar feeling bloomed in her chest, startling in its intensity. It was a confusing mix of gratitude, shock, and something else. Something she was afraid to name. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a duke, but a man. A man who had just declared, in his own reserved way, that she was his. The carriage ride back to her townhouse was thick with a new kind of silence. It was no longer the awkward silence of strangers, but a heavy, charged quiet, brimming with unspoken things. The events of the afternoon played over and over in Aurelia's mind. His defense of her had been so swift, so absolute. She was no longer afraid of him. Her curiosity had burned through her fear, leaving a bold, pressing need for the truth. She could not marry this man, could not bind her life to his, while floating in this sea of uncertainty. The carriage stopped in front of her home. The footman opened the door. But instead of getting out, Aurelia turned to the Duke. The interior of the carriage was dim, casting his severe features in shadow. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "May I ask you a question?" "You may," he replied, his tone neutral. She took a breath, gathering all her courage. "Why me? At the ball, you had your choice of any woman in that room. Women with beauty, with wealth, with connections. Women society would have deemed far more worthy." She used his own word, throwing it back at him not as an accusation, but as a genuine, desperate inquiry. "Why did you truly choose me?" He did not answer immediately. He stared out the window at the quiet street, his gloved hands resting on his knee. The silence stretched, and Aurelia feared he would dismiss her question, retreating once more behind his wall of ducal reserve. When he finally turned to look at her, the change in his expression was breathtaking. The mask was gone. In its place was a raw, aching vulnerability that stunned her into silence. The formidable Duke of Alistair looked lost. "Because I have been looking for you for 10 years, he said, his voice low and rough, with an emotion she could not identify. Aurelia could only stare, her mind struggling to make sense of his words. I do not understand. We had never met before that night." "Yes, we had," he said softly. A faint, sad smile touched his lips, transforming his face. "You would not remember me. I was not a duke then. I was simply Alistair Hayes, the second son, a bookish nobody with no prospects and no title." He leaned back against the squabs, his gaze distant, as if looking into the past. "It was in Florence, in the Laurentian Library. I was there to study architectural manuscripts. It was a hot afternoon. The room was empty, except for one other person. A young English girl with quiet eyes and a smudge of ink on her cheek. She was utterly absorbed in a copy of Dante. Aurelia's breath caught in her throat. A memory, faded and dreamlike, surfaced from the depths of her mind. A sun-drenched library. The scent of old vellum. A tall, serious young man with kind eyes who had approached her and asked, in hesitant but passable Italian, what she thought of a particular passage. You looked up, Alistair continued, his eyes fixed on her face. And you began to speak, not about the romance, but about the structure of the verse, the linguistic choices, the political allegories. You were brilliant, more alive and passionate in that dusty library than any woman I had ever met in a ballroom. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat. She remembered. She remembered the conversation, the easy camaraderie, the startling connection with a stranger who saw the world as she did. It had been a single, perfect afternoon, a jewel she had kept hidden away, convinced it was a figment of her imagination. We spoke for hours, he went on, his voice growing thick. I was enchanted. I was going to ask your name, to beg to see you again. But a courier arrived, a message from England. My elder brother, there had been a riding accident. He was gone. I was the new heir. I had to leave immediately. He closed his eyes for a moment, the pain of the memory still sharp on his features. By the time I could think of anything but grief and the crushing weight of my new duties, you were gone. I didn't have your name. I didn't know where you were staying. I only had the memory of a girl in a library who understood Dante. He opened his eyes, and the vulnerability in them was a physical blow. I became the Duke. I put away the scholar. I built walls around myself to survive the duties I never wanted. But I never stopped looking. At every ball, every dreary social event, I searched the faces, hoping to find that girl. For 10 years I looked. His gaze held hers, intense and pleading. And then, that night, at the ball, I saw you. You were standing by the wall, looking so lost, and I heard what that vile woman Beatrice said about you. And in that moment, all my carefully constructed plans to court you properly, to reintroduce myself, they all evaporated. I saw the world treating you as if you were invisible, and I could not bear it. I was a coward. I used my power and my title to claim you, because I was terrified that if I hesitated, I would lose you again. He let out a long, shuddering breath. My proposal was not a strategy, Aurelia. It was an act of sheer, selfish desperation. I chose you because I have been half in love with you for a decade. The confession hung in the small, dim space of the carriage, vast and overwhelming. The cold, ruthless Duke was a fiction. Beneath it was a lonely scholar, a man grieving a life he never got to live, who had spent 10 years searching for a ghost. A single tear escaped Aurelia's eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of profound, earth-shattering recognition. All the pieces of the puzzle that was Alistair Hayes clicked into place. His distance, his quiet protection, the gift of books. It was all part of the same silent, decade-long story. I remember, she whispered, her voice trembling. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. You do? Yes, she said, a watery smile touching her lips. The man in the Florence library, the one who knew about tercets and ghibellines. I never forgot you. I thought I had imagined how special that afternoon was. It was the only time a man had ever seemed to see me, not my family name or my lack of dowry, but me. She reached out, her hand hesitating for a moment before she gently placed it over his. His gloved fingers were rigid with tension, but they slowly, cautiously, turned to clasp hers. Alistair, she said, the name feeling both new and deeply familiar on her tongue. You are not the only one who was lonely. The last of his formidable control crumbled. He brought her hand to his lips, his touch achingly gentle. He did not kiss her knuckles as a duke would. He turned her hand over and pressed a soft, warm kiss into the center of her palm, a gesture of such intimate, heartfelt reverence that it made her entire body ache. He lifted his head, his dark eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The distance between them had vanished, erased by a 10-year-old memory. He was no longer the Duke of Alistair, and she was not the spinster Lady Aurelia. They were just a man and a woman who had found each other, lost each other, and, by some miracle, found each other again. He leaned forward, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. She met him halfway. The kiss was nothing like she had ever imagined. It was not a spark of passion, but a slow, deep melting. It was a kiss of homecoming. It tasted of relief, of years of silent longing, of the end of a long and lonely search. It was a quiet promise that neither of them would ever be invisible again. When they finally drew apart, the world outside the carriage seemed to have faded away entirely. There was only the small, warm space they occupied, filled with the truth that had finally been spoken. I believe, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion as he rested his forehead against hers, that my library is in dire need of cataloguing, especially the Greek and Scandinavian sections. Aurelia laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like a release. I am certain it is, Your Grace. I am certain it is. 2 years later, the ducal mansion was no longer a cold, imposing mausoleum. Sunlight streamed through tall windows that had once been perpetually draped. The scent of beeswax and lemon polish had replaced the stale air of disuse. And everywhere, there were books. They spilled from shelves, were stacked on tables, and rested on every available surface. The house was filled with a quiet, happy warmth that radiated from its new duchess. Aurelia had not just become a part of the household. She had brought it to life. The staff, who had once feared their remote and silent master, now adored the kind, intelligent duchess who knew all their names and treated them with gentle respect. Alistair was a changed man. The granite facade was gone, melted away by the steady warmth of Aurelia's love. The Ton was still baffled by him. The ruthless duke now smiled. He was often seen walking in the gardens hand in hand with his wife, or sitting with her in the library, their heads bent together over some ancient text. The scholar he had been forced to bury had been resurrected. Aurelia sat at a large desk in the library, a stack of foreign correspondence before her. She was now an indispensable partner in his ducal duties, her linguistic skills proving to be an asset far more valuable than any dowry. She translated, she advised, she organized. She had found not a cage, but a purpose. Alistair entered the room, no longer with the heavy tread of a burdened statesman, but with a light, easy stride. He came to stand behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to the top of her head, inhaling the scent of her hair. What has my brilliant duchess discovered today? He murmured against her hair. A German landholder is attempting to cheat you on a timber contract. she replied without looking up, tapping a passage with her finger. He clearly assumes you do not read his language. His flattery in the first paragraph is directly contradicted by the numbers in the third. Alistair chuckled, a low, warm sound that still made her heart flutter. And what do you recommend I write in my reply? I have already drafted it for you, she said, pushing a sheet of paper towards him. In flawless, formal German. I believe the phrase, duplicitous swine, is implied rather than stated, but the message is clear. He picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the lines. A slow smile spread across his face. Aurelia, my love, you are terrifying. I am thorough, she corrected, finally turning to look up at him. The love she saw in his eyes was a constant, steady flame that warmed her to her very soul. From the corner of the room came a small, happy gurgle. In a bassinet near the warmth of the fireplace, their 6-month-old son, Arthur, waved his fists in the air. He had his father's dark hair and, Aurelia was convinced, her own curious, observant eyes. Alistair's gaze softened as he looked from his wife to his son. All of this, he said, his voice quiet with wonder. My whole life I was drowning in duty. I thought happiness was a luxury I could not afford. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hand in his. You are not a luxury, Aurelia. You are a necessity. You are the air I breathe. Aurelia's fingers curled around his. She thought of the desperate, invisible woman she had been, standing at the edge of a ballroom, resigned to a life of quiet obsolescence. She had believed her story was over, but she had been wrong. It had simply been waiting for the right chapter to begin. Her worth had never been about a title, or a fortune, or a pretty face. Her worth was in her mind, in her quiet strength, in the unique way she saw the world. It had just taken one other person, a lonely scholar in a ducal mask, to see it too. It is never too late, is it? She whispered, looking from her husband to her child, her heart full to bursting. No, my love, Alistair agreed, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. For us, it was just in time. Outside, the London rain began to fall, but inside the library, surrounded by books and love, the world was bright and warm and utterly perfect. The ghost from the feast had found her home, not as a duchess, but as a beloved equal, a cherished partner, a woman finally, completely seen.